When my husband Julian walked through our front door 10 years ago, he expected to find dinner on the table and his submissive wife waiting. Instead, the house was dead silent. I was completely gone. The only things I left behind on his desk were a sealed manila envelope, a torn photograph, and my gold wedding ring. For a decade, I completely vanished from his life, changing my identity and building a new world from the ashes of his betrayal. Julian thought he had won, that his wealth and influence had successfully broken me. He never expected to see me again. But 10 years later, at our daughter's lavish wedding, the church doors opened and he turned around. The moment his eyes met mine, the color drained completely from his face, and he froze in sheer terror. He thought I was hiding. He didn't know I was back to take everything. My name is Evelyn Porter, and I am 44 years old. 10 years ago, at the age of 34, I was trapped in a marriage defined by profound emotional betrayal and cold manipulation. When my husband Julian walked through our front door that evening, he expected to find dinner on the table and his submissive wife waiting to cater to his demands. Instead, the house was dead silent. I was completely gone. I spent weeks meticulously planning my exit while he was away on an extended business trip, ensuring I left no physical trace behind. The only things I left resting on his mahogany desk were a sealed manila envelope, a torn photograph from the day our relationship shattered, and my gold wedding ring. For a decade, I completely vanished from his life, changing my identity and building a new world from the ashes of his betrayal. Julian thought he had won, believing his immense wealth and corporate influence had successfully broken my spirit. He never expected to see me again. Before I tell you what was hidden inside that envelope, make sure to follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. He thought I was hiding in fear. He had absolutely no idea that I was simply waiting for the perfect moment to return, or that the countdown to his exposure had already begun the moment I closed that front door behind me. To the outside world, Julian and I had a perfect life. He was a powerful corporate executive, commanding rooms with absolute authority, while I was the quiet wife managing our estate and raising our daughter, Chloe. But behind closed doors, Julian treated me like an accessory, a piece of property he owned rather than a partner. He looked down on me, completely underestimating my intellect because I had paused my own career to support his ambitions. He assumed my world revolved only around his schedule and his needs, never imagining I was paying attention to the cracks in his perfect facade. The breaking point came on a rainy Tuesday when I discovered a hidden digital folder on his home computer. Julian was keeping a dark financial secret. He was actively working with corporate lawyers to draft a forged prenuptial amendment designed to legally strip me of any rights to our shared assets in the event of a split. Worse, the documents revealed he was setting up a network of illegal shell companies to hide his escalating corporate fraud and shield his wealth from the board. He was planning to discard me and leave me completely penniless, confident that I lacked the resources to fight back. Instead of confronting him and facing his high-priced legal team in a rigged battle, I decided to play a long, silent game of my own. I quietly copied the incriminating records, packed our bags, and took Chloe away in the middle of the night. We dropped completely off the grid, leaving him with an empty house and no legal leverage. I knew that fighting him out in the open back then would destroy me, so I chose a different path. One that required absolute patience. Vanishing completely wasn't easy, but it was the only way to survive. I moved across the country to a quiet town, reverted to my maiden name, Porter, and used my background in data analysis to quietly build a highly successful legal auditing consultancy. I worked late into the night, built a roster of elite corporate clients, and established financial independence while raising Chloe in absolute peace, far away from Julian's toxic influence. While Julian spent a decade assuming I was broken, struggling, or living in poverty, I was actually building a massive, protected financial portfolio that eclipsed everything he thought he controlled. As the years passed, Chloe grew into a brilliant, independent young woman, excelling in her studies and eventually building a life of her own. When she met a wonderful man and got engaged, the time came to plan a high society wedding back in California. Chloe knew everything her father had attempted to do to us, and she completely supported my decision to stay out of the visible wedding planning. Julian assumed he was the one generously financing his daughter's dream day, completely unaware that the anonymous wedding planner and the massive trust fund handling the expenses were actually coming from me. I professionally kept my name off the official guest list and avoided any venue walkthroughs to ensure Julian remained entirely oblivious to my return until the absolute perfect moment. For 10 long years, he believed he had successfully erased me from his life and legacy. He had no idea that I had been watching his corporate moves from the shadows, waiting for the day when his pride would be at its highest and his defenses at their lowest. The grand church in Sacramento was filled to capacity for Chloe's high society wedding. The architecture was breathtaking, with soaring stained glass windows casting vibrant colors across the polished stone floors. Julian stood near the altar, acting as the proud, wealthy patriarch of the family. He wore a perfectly tailored suit, mingling effortlessly with the elite guests and soaking in the widespread admiration of the crowd. He was in his element, radiating the same old supreme arrogance, fully convinced that he was the undisputed master of ceremonies and the sole provider of his daughter's happiness. Then, the heavy wooden church doors opened, and the processional music suddenly changed to a commanding, elegant melody. The entire congregation turned their heads in anticipation. Instead of walking in quietly or hiding in the back rows, I entered the sanctuary alone. I wore a breathtaking, sophisticated designer outfit that projected absolute wealth, confidence, and authority. I walked down the aisle with my head held high, completely commanding the room. The whispers began immediately as old family friends recognized my face. Julian turned around, expecting to see just another late arrival, but instead, his eyes met mine. The reaction was instantaneous. The supreme confidence evaporated from his expression in a fraction of a second. The color drained completely from his face, leaving him looking frail and ghost-like. His hands began to visibly tremble, and he froze right there in front of the altar, utterly paralyzed by the sudden appearance of the wife who had vanished into thin air 10 years ago. During the reception, the lavish celebration continued around us, but the air between Julian and me was thick with unresolved tension. He tracked my movements across the ballroom with desperate eyes until he finally found an opportunity to corner me in a quiet, private corridor near the balcony. The moment we were away from the crowd, his old arrogance flared up, a desperate mask trying to cover the deep panic shaking his voice. He stepped into my space and demanded to know how I dared to show up uninvited, aggressively threatening to have security throw me out of the venue. I remained perfectly calm, leaning against the marble pillar and looking at him with the cold calculation of a woman who was 10 steps ahead. I didn't flinch, nor did I raise my voice. Instead, I gently reminded him that he had no power to remove me. I revealed that I hadn't just shown up as a casual guest. I had funded this entire $1 million wedding anonymously through a private trust fund because he was too broke to afford it himself. The color drained from his face yet again as I dropped the final hint about the manila envelope he had opened 10 years ago. I whispered that the documents inside weren't just a simple goodbye letter. They were copies of his original corporate frauds, and I had spent the last decade tracking those illegal shell companies as his crimes grew exponentially worse. The private meeting took place in a secluded conference room at the venue during the late hours of the reception. Julian, his personal attorney, and James Mitchell sat across the table from me, the festive music from the ballroom muffled by the thick doors. Julian's lawyer pulled a newly delivered legal notice from a courier packet, began skimming the pages, and froze. Within seconds, his professional composure completely shattered, and his face turned entirely pale as he looked over at his client with absolute dread. Julian demanded to know what the paperwork meant, his voice cracking under the pressure. I leaned forward and delivered the devastating truth. Over the last decade, his corporate empire had quietly deteriorated due to his ongoing mismanagement and hidden liabilities. My auditing firm had spent the last 2 years systematically buying up the primary distressed debt, holding his entire corporate structure together. I looked him dead in the eye and explained the reality of the situation. He didn't own his business anymore. My private investment trust was now his primary creditor and majority stakeholder. I calmly presented him with a final, non-negotiable ultimatum. He could choose to step down quietly from the corporate board, surrender his remaining personal shares, and transfer his residual property assets into a protected trust fund exclusively for Chloe's future. If he agreed, he could walk away without a public scandal. If he refused, James Mitchell would immediately release our comprehensive forensic audit, along with 10 years of compiled evidence regarding his illegal shell companies, directly to federal investigators. Julian stared at the signature line, realizing his decades of arrogance had finally run out of time. Julian stared at the document for a final, agonizing moment before his hand trembled, and he pressed the pen to the paper. With that single signature, the corporate empire he had built on a foundation of lies and manipulation crumbled entirely by his own hand. He stood up without saying a word, completely defeated by the very woman he had spent a lifetime underestimating, and walked out into the cold night. I watched him leave, a deep sense of peace finally washing over me as I realized my 10-year journey of quiet resilience was finally complete. If you were in my shoes, would you have waited 10 years to deliver justice, or would you have fought him openly from the start? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. I am leaving 2 other incredible stories on the final screen right now that are channel favorites. Click on one, and they will definitely surprise you.